When Buckingham Palace released its latest statement, no one could believe what they were reading. Prince Edward, long known for his calm restraint, had just done the unthinkable, cancelling Queen Camilla's long-planned European royal tour. But what made this move even more explosive was his follow-up announcement that Princess Catherine would represent the crown instead. Overnight, the monarchy was divided, and Camilla's silence spoke louder than any denial. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It was a morning unlike any other in recent royal memory. Reporters camped outside the palace gates were jolted awake by the official statement, their phones lighting up with the breaking headline that shattered every expectation. Prince Edward had intervened in a matter previously believed to be untouchable to the Queen Consort's personal agenda. For months, Camilla's European tour had been planned meticulously, touted as her defining diplomatic moment, a chance to cement her status as the stabilizing matriarch of the new reign. Invitations had been sent, security arranged, and every hotel booked in the name of modern royal representation. Yet, with one signature, Edward dismantled it all. The cancellation wasn't just a logistical decision, it was a royal earthquake. Inside Buckingham Palace, staffers whispered about Edward's tone during the decision meeting, calm but unyielding. Gone was the quiet, dutiful brother often seen fading into the background of grand occasions. This Edward was resolute, his presence sharp with the kind of authority the late Queen Elizabeth once carried without question. It became immediately clear that the youngest son of the late Queen had stepped into a role that few had anticipated, the guardian of royal integrity. His move wasn't just administrative, it was symbolic. In a family built on hierarchy and caution, Edward had defied both, and in doing so, ignited the most talked-about internal power shift since Charles's coronation. What gave his act more weight was the timing. King Charles's health had become a subject of quiet concern, and though the palace kept his condition carefully private, those within the royal circle knew he was delegating more authority than ever before. Edward, loyal yet fiercely protective of the institution, saw the cracks forming. To him, Camilla's upcoming tour with its lavish receptions and questionable guest lists represented not diplomacy, but distraction. It was, in his eyes, a vanity project dressed as duty, and for a man raised under Elizabeth's creed of service above self, that was intolerable. Behind closed doors, advisors warned what would follow. This could split the crown, one senior aide reportedly said, fearing that the decision would expose the fragile alliances keeping the monarchy afloat. Yet Edward didn't waver. He knew the cost of hesitation in a family where every move was watched by millions. The press release was brief, sterile, and yet lethal in its precision. The European tour was cancelled due to restructuring of royal engagements. But it was the final line that made history. Her Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales, will represent the crown in forthcoming engagements abroad. The shift was immediate. Across Britain, the public's reaction swung dramatically in Catherine's favour. To many, she was the natural embodiment of grace and modern monarchy, a woman who had earned respect through composure, humility, and quiet strength. Her appointment was hailed as both rightful and refreshing, especially after months of tension and rumour surrounding Camilla's expanding influence. Social media lit up with praise, newspapers printed bold headlines, and commentators called it a return to the values of the late Queen's reign. But inside the palace walls, the mood was anything but celebratory. For Camilla, the blow was deeply personal. She had invested months preparing for this tour, rehearsing speeches, reviewing itinerary details, and arranging meetings meant to enhance her international image. To have it stripped away, without warning, and replaced with Catherine's name, felt like a public humiliation engineered from within her own circle. The corridors of Clarence House buzzed with disbelief. While the palace maintained its measured tone, the private tension was undeniable. A silent war was brewing, one that could no longer be hidden behind smiles and ceremonial grace. And yet, amidst the chaos, one thing stood out. Edward's decision wasn't spontaneous. It was deliberate, calculated, and built on something far deeper than mere disapproval. Those who knew him best claimed he had been quietly gathering information for weeks, piecing together reports that raised troubling questions about the tour's true purpose and those advising the Queen Consort. But the question no one dared to ask publicly was the one burning behind palace walls. Why did Edward strike now, and what did he uncover that made him act so decisively against the Queen Consort herself? Their feud didn't begin overnight. Insiders now claim that tensions between Prince Edward and Queen Camilla had been brewing for years, hidden beneath layers of formal smiles and polished diplomacy. From seating disputes at royal events to whispered accusations of favoritism, Edward had grown increasingly disillusioned by what he viewed as Camilla's political monarchy. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, during the early years of Charles's reign. Camilla's growing influence inside palace corridors was subtle yet undeniable. She began to take charge of royal engagements with a confidence that, to many, bordered on control. At first, Edward dismissed it as enthusiasm, the kind of assertiveness any modern consort might display. But over time, he began to notice the shifts in the way Camilla's schedule was, prioritized over others, the way her family appeared in press releases once reserved solely for the Windsors. Even during major royal events, there were murmurs of discontent from senior courtiers who felt that Edward and Sophie, loyal and dutiful, were being overshadowed. Behind the regal smiles and glittering appearances, Edward's patience was wearing thin. Every engagement where Camilla stood center stage seemed to push him further from the spotlight he had quietly earned through decades of service. There were dinners where seating arrangements mysteriously placed him far from senior diplomats, receptions where introductions skipped over him entirely. The message, though never spoken aloud, was unmistakable. Camilla's reign as the Queen Consort came with her own hierarchy, and Edward was expected to adjust to it. Sophie, ever perceptive, recognized her husband's growing frustration, but rather than feed it with anger, she offered quiet loyalty and balance, especially toward Catherine. That subtle alliance between the Wessexes and the Waleses didn't form out of ambition. It was born out of shared respect and a mutual understanding of the late Queen's ideals. Catherine admired Sophie's humility, her refusal to play palace politics, and Sophie, in turn, saw in Catherine the same steady grace that once defined Queen Elizabeth. Together, they embodied what Edward called duty without vanity. Meanwhile, Edward's private attempts to warn his brother went unheeded. He had quietly arranged meetings with Charles, hoping to express his concerns about Camilla's increasing control. But those meetings often ended the same way, with Charles defending his wife's efforts and urging Edward to see the bigger picture. Each dismissal stung deeper. Edward wasn't driven by resentment. He was driven by loyalty to a tradition he believed was being rewritten for personal image rather than service. "The crown doesn't belong to individuals," he reportedly told a confidant. "It belongs to the nation, and once it becomes personal, it loses its sanctity." Matters came to a head when Edward discovered that he had been excluded from key discussions surrounding upcoming foreign tours meetings he had once attended as a trusted representative of the monarchy. The final insult came when Camilla's advisors began handling correspondence meant for the Royal Diplomatic Office, effectively sidelining Edward's input. To him, this was more than political maneuvering. It was the erasure of the monarchy's moral foundation, the slow corrosion of everything his mother had built. The tension between Edward and Camilla was no longer confined to whispered glances or brief exchanges during state events. It had become an open secret among palace staff, a quiet war fought with icy courtesy and measured words. While Camilla continued to charm foreign dignitaries with laughter and warmth, Edward's resolve hardened. He could no longer ignore what he saw as a dangerous shift, a transformation of royal duty into personal influence. In those private, sleepless nights, Edward often reflected on his mother's reign. Elizabeth had never sought attention. Her power came from restraint, her authority from humility. Watching the new royal order unfold, Edward felt an ache and a growing conviction that the monarchy was drifting off course. He made a silent vow to act, not out of defiance, but out of duty to the values she had instilled in him: honor, integrity, and service above all else. As the royal curtain pulled tighter, Edward's next move would prove he was no longer content to stand in the shadows. And it all began with a confidential dossier that shook him to his core. Weeks before the cancellation, Edward reportedly received a classified briefing from the Foreign Office, a document detailing severe diplomatic concerns about Camilla's European tour itinerary. What he found inside was not just political, it was personal. It exposed sensitive communications, suggesting that Camilla's private advisors had negotiated unauthorized meetings and financial partnerships in her name. To Edward, it wasn't just a scandal waiting to happen, it was a betrayal of the crown. The report landed on Edward's desk under quiet circumstances, delivered by a senior Foreign Office official known for his discretion. It was marked restricted circulation, the kind of label reserved for matters that could compromise the integrity of the monarchy if leaked. At first glance, it appeared to be a routine diplomatic assessment, travel security, host nation protocols, and projected media responses. But as Edward read deeper, the tone shifted. It referenced non-official intermediaries connected to the Queen Consort's entourage, who had allegedly arranged private meetings with European cultural ministers, bypassing the Crown's established diplomatic channels. There were notes of luxury sponsorship offers, details of private benefactors funding certain portions of the tour, all approved without oversight from the palace's International Liaison Office. It was the kind of entanglement the monarchy had spent decades avoiding, and now it was staring Edward in the face. For Edward, it was more than an administrative red flag. It was a moral alarm. He understood that even the faintest whiff of impropriety could reignite public skepticism about the royal institution, especially in the post-Elizabeth era. To see Camilla's inner circle conducting business in a manner that blurred the line between royal representation and personal interest enraged him. He felt the ghost of his mother's teachings whispering in his ear, "Duty must always be above advantage." If this report ever reached the press, the damage to the monarchy's credibility could be irreversible. Foreign leaders would see not a dignified crown, but a divided one compromised by internal self-interest. He called in 2 of the few remaining aides, known for their unwavering loyalty to Queen Elizabeth, men and women who had served under her code of silent discipline. For hours, they combed through the pages, cross-checking every claim and correspondence. What they uncovered confirmed his worst fears. Some of the alleged sponsors were connected to organizations currently under international scrutiny. The optics were disastrous. The monarchy, Edward realized, was weeks away from walking into a potential scandal that could erupt mid-tour. "If this goes public," one of the aides said gravely, "we won't just lose face, we'll lose faith." That night, Edward reportedly confronted Camilla's private secretary, demanding an explanation for the irregularities. The exchange was tense, almost explosive. The secretary defended the arrangements as external coordination for efficiency, but Edward's response was sharp and unrelenting. "Efficiency," he said coldly, "is no excuse for undermining the institution my mother built her life defending." Those words would later echo through palace corridors as whispers of Edward's challenge to the Queen Consort's authority reached the ears of those closest to her. In the days that followed, Edward struggled with his next step. The report was undeniable, the consequences inevitable. He couldn't go to the press that would destroy the monarchy. He couldn't confront Camilla directly that would ignite a public feud. But he also couldn't stay silent. Watching the family's reputation spiral was not an option. As the weight of responsibility pressed heavier on his shoulders, one truth became increasingly clear to him. The public's trust in the royal family rested on only one figure who had never faltered, whose dignity and humility remained untarnished: Catherine, the Princess of Wales. And with that realization came Edward's most daring move, yet a direct call to King Charles that would rewrite the royal itinerary and send shockwaves through the Mayer family. It was past midnight when Prince Edward finally called. King Charles, already worn by weeks of medical treatment, listened in silence as his younger brother detailed the full extent of Camilla's upcoming European disaster. The air crackled with tension. By the end of that conversation, one thing was clear. Charles reluctantly agreed that the tour could no longer go forward. For hours, Edward had paced the long corridors of Bagshot Park, the confidential dossier still open on his desk. He knew the risk of calling his brother at such a late hour, yet he also knew the longer he waited, the greater the danger. When the phone finally rang, the two brothers spoke not as princes but as men burdened by duty. Edward's voice was steady, though heavy with conviction, as he laid out every troubling detail: the private sponsorships, the questionable diplomatic arrangements, the looming headlines that could destroy their credibility abroad. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't soften. Every word was weighed and deliberate, every pause charged with the gravity of what it meant to confront the king himself about the Queen Consort's judgment. Charles's silence on the other end said more than words ever could. For decades, Edward had known his brother as a man of heart, loyal, compassionate, but easily torn between affection and responsibility. Tonight, however, that struggle reached its breaking point. When Edward spoke of the Foreign Office warnings, of the potential fallout that could ignite across Europe if the tour continued, Charles finally exhaled a deep, weary sigh. The monarch, so accustomed to public composure, was suddenly just a man caught between two worlds, one ruled by love and the other by legacy. Sources later described that call as one of the most emotionally charged moments of Charles's reign. Edward spoke not as an adversary to Camilla, but as a guardian of the monarchy's soul. "This isn't about her," he reportedly said. "It's about what the world will think of us." There was no anger in his tone, only a haunting reminder that their late mother's shadow still stretched across every decision they made. "She believed the monarchy should never bend for convenience," Edward continued softly, "and we're bending too far." Those words cut deep. They echoed Queen Elizabeth's quiet wisdom, and Charles knew it. As the conversation dragged into the early hours, Charles called in two senior advisors who had been on standby since his illness worsened. Both men, known for their cautious diplomacy, agreed with Edward. The optics of proceeding with Camilla's tour would be disastrous. The media was already circling, the press eager for scandal, and the faintest hint of impropriety could trigger an international spectacle. The king's health had made him vulnerable, but what Edward offered wasn't confrontation, it was protection. He was, in essence, preserving not just the monarchy's name, but his brother's dignity. Edward's final argument was decisive. He spoke of Catherine not as a replacement, but as a saviour of royal grace. Her composure, her consistency, her unshakable reputation for sincerity, these were the traits that could restore public faith. "Let her lead this one," Edward urged. "The world still believes in her. She's the only one who can steady the ship." For several long moments, there was nothing but silence. And then, with the faint rustle of papers, came the unmistakable sound of a pen signing. It wasn't just a bureaucratic approval. It was the symbolic end of one era and the reluctant dawn of another. Those closest to the king later recalled how he sat quietly after the call, staring into the distance with the same expression he wore at his coronation: solemn, resolute, and wounded by the weight of the crown. Edward's decision had been firm, but Charles's agreement was reluctant, pained by love, yet anchored by duty. Still, there was no going back. At 2:47 a.m., an internal message was sent to the palace communications office: "Cancel all European tour logistics. Prepare a statement by morning." And just like that, history shifted. By dawn, the world knew, and so did Camilla. But what began as a matter of protocol quickly spiraled into one of the monarchy's most personal betrayals. When Queen Camilla opened her morning briefing, she froze. The cancellation was official. Worse, Catherine was now named as her replacement. Sources close to the Queen Consort describe what followed as a storm of disbelief. Inside Clarence House, aides reportedly heard raised voices, shattered glass, and the chilling words, "He's finished." For a moment, time seemed to stop. The Queen Consort, who had carefully built her image as the stabilizing force beside the king, now stood stripped of her most public triumph. The European tour wasn't just another royal engagement. It was her opportunity to prove she could command respect abroad, to show the world she wasn't just a figure tolerated by history, but one accepted by it. Having that moment handed to Catherine felt like an unforgivable humiliation. The reports of the cancellation had spread like wildfire across palace corridors before breakfast, leaving staff uneasy and whispering. Some described the tension in Clarence House as suffocating, a silence so heavy it felt dangerous. When Charles entered her private sitting room later that morning, he found Camilla pacing relentlessly, gripping the briefing papers that announced her replacement. "Did you approve this?" she demanded, her voice trembling between fury and heartbreak. Charles, still weak from his recent treatments, hesitated before speaking that single pause, confirming her worst suspicion. "You let him do this," she accused. "You let Edward humiliate me." The argument that followed, insiders say, was one of the most explosive in recent royal history. Camilla's words poured out with years of frustration, resentment, and betrayal. Anger not just at the decision, but at the realization that her influence within the monarchy was no longer absolute. The king, torn between loyalty to his wife and his brother's warning, tried to reason with her. He insisted the move was about protecting the monarchy, not diminishing her role. But to Camilla, those words were hollow. Every justification felt like a betrayal disguised as diplomacy. "You think she'll save the monarchy?" she reportedly hissed, referring to Catherine. "Then let her have it. Let her have all of it." That sentence, whispered through clenched teeth, would soon echo throughout the palace, a line that symbolized not only the depth of her rage, but her growing sense of isolation. Meanwhile, royal aides scrambled to contain the situation. Damage control briefings were quietly circulated, instructing staff to remain unavailable for comment. But no amount of internal discipline could stop the cracks from showing. The palace press office, overwhelmed by inquiries, offered a vague statement about schedule adjustments. Still, the silence from Clarence House was deafening. In the absence of clarity, speculation filled the void. Tabloids painted Catherine as the dutiful peacemaker, stepping up in a time of royal strain, while Camilla was portrayed as volatile and threatened. Public sympathy shifted almost instantly. Across social media, hashtags praising Catherine as the people's representative began trending within hours. Her photograph, radiant and composed, circulated beside headlines about her upcoming diplomatic tour. In contrast, Camilla's image began to fracture. Commentators noted her absence from public view, while anonymous palace insiders began leaking details of growing unrest between the royal households. For the first time since her coronation, the Queen Consort's grip on public favour seemed to falter, and the narrative was no longer hers to control. That loss of control fueled a deeper paranoia. Those close to her said she became convinced that Edward and Catherine were quietly conspiring to erase her influence, replacing her one duty at a time until there was nothing left of her public role. She began reviewing every recent decision through a lens of suspicion, wondering how long they had been planning this and how deeply Catherine's rise had been coordinated. Each briefing she received felt more like an indictment than information. The atmosphere inside Clarence House grew unbearable. Aides tiptoed through hallways, terrified of becoming collateral in the royal storm. Even Charles, once her strongest ally, began to withdraw emotionally, exhausted by the endless cycle of confrontation. Camilla's isolation became a complete queen without confidence, surrounded by whispers she could no longer silence. But as Camilla plotted her next move, the public response outside the palace walls would deliver a blow no royal spin could soften. By noon, the story had gone global. European media hailed Catherine as the people's ambassador, while headlines across Britain screamed, "Camilla sidelined." For the first time since the coronation, the monarchy's moral authority seemed to rest not with the Queen Consort, but with the Princess of Wales. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Across television panels, radio shows, and social media feeds, one narrative took hold. Catherine's appointment wasn't just a change in itinerary, it was a transformation of image. For years, the monarchy had battled accusations of disconnect, struggling to prove its relevance in a modern world. But now, Catherine's name, calm, poised, and unblemished, became the rallying point for a public hungry for authenticity. She wasn't just representing the crown, she was redeeming it. The nation's pulse shifted in real time, and within hours, global diplomats echoed what the British public already believed: that the future of the monarchy didn't reside in ceremony or hierarchy, but in humanity, and Catherine embodied it flawlessly. In European capitals, foreign ministries discreetly expressed relief. Some had privately voiced concern about Camilla's planned meetings, especially after whispers of irregular arrangements began circulating among diplomatic circles. Edward's intervention, once seen as daring, was now being quietly applauded as prudent. The British Foreign Office received messages of support from ambassadors describing Catherine's upcoming visit as a return to integrity. Her mere presence, it seemed, had redefined the monarchy's image abroad, soft power restored, faith renewed. Edward's gamble had paid off, at least for now. At home, the public's emotional response reached fever pitch. Across platforms, people praised Catherine's grace under pressure, contrasting it sharply with Camilla's perceived entitlement. One leads with humility, the other with ego, one viral post declared. In just a matter of hours, social media had rewritten the story of the royal hierarchy. Catherine, once the supportive figure in the background, was now being hailed as the heart of the institution. Crowds began gathering outside Kensington Palace, holding handwritten signs that read, "Our true Queen." It was a groundswell of affection so powerful that even seasoned royal reporters admitted they hadn't seen anything like it since the days of Princess Diana. The public's sympathy also extended to King Charles, who suddenly found himself cast as the weary patriarch caught between duty and emotion. Many viewed him as a man torn loyal to his wife, but quietly relieved that his brother and daughter-in-law had prevented a looming crisis. Editorials described him as a monarch in conflict with his own crown, a ruler forced to choose between preserving unity and maintaining credibility. For Charles, it was a bittersweet moment. The monarchy had regained public favour, but at the cost of his marriage's stability and his queen's pride. Amidst the noise, Edward and Sophie found themselves quietly vindicated. They had long lived in the shadow of their elder siblings, often dismissed as peripheral figures in the royal narrative. But now, the public began to see them in a new light as custodians of the late Queen's vision. Their decision to act decisively, even against palace convention, was interpreted not as rebellion, but as preservation. Newspapers dubbed them the silent sentinels of Elizabeth's legacy, a phrase that spread with reverence. To many, Edward had proven that loyalty to the crown sometimes meant standing against those who wore it. And yet, behind the applause and global praise, a darker reality was taking shape. Those within political and aristocratic circles who had long aligned themselves with Camilla's camp began to stir. Senior figures in Parliament, known for their quiet loyalty to the Queen Consort, started questioning Edward's authority to override royal arrangements. Anonymous briefings began leaking to select journalists, painting the decision as an internal overreach rather than a necessary intervention. What had started as a moment of triumph for Catherine and Edward was slowly transforming into the beginning of a power struggle that threatened to unravel the very unity the family had fought to preserve. But while the people cheered, a storm was gathering, one that would test Catherine's composure and expose the full scale of the monarchy's inner conflict. Catherine's calm demeanour during her first press conference stunned even her critics. Dressed in quiet elegance, she spoke of unity, duty, and hope, words that carried the echo of Queen Elizabeth's reign. But behind the grace, Catherine knew the stakes were higher than ever. She wasn't just representing Britain, she was stepping into a battlefield Camilla believed was rightfully hers. The world watched as Catherine stood before the presses, microphones, her voice unwavering, her tone both humble and commanding. She began by acknowledging the importance of service, not as a privilege, but as a calling. Her words were deliberate, carefully chosen to balance strength with compassion. "In every act of duty," she said, "we carry the weight of those who came before us, and the hope of those who will follow." It was more than a statement. It was a quiet declaration of continuity, a promise that the monarchy still had a heart that beat for the people. Within minutes, her speech was being broadcast around the world, and analysts were already calling it a masterclass in modern diplomacy. Catherine's composure struck even those within the royal press corps who had long favoured Camilla. There was no trace of triumph in her tone, no sense of victory or vindication, only sincerity. To many, it was a subtle but unmistakable contrast to Camilla's tendency toward control and self-assurance. Catherine didn't command the stage. She invited the world into her calm, and that, more than any headline or photograph, shifted the tone of the entire royal narrative. Suddenly, the monarchy didn't feel fractured or outdated. It felt reborn under her steady influence. Her first meeting with foreign ambassadors later that week cemented that impression. Delegations from Europe and the Commonwealth praised her authenticity. Instead of scripted gestures, she offered genuine connection, listening more than she spoke, expressing gratitude instead of grandeur. One ambassador was overheard saying, "She has that rare quality authority without arrogance." Those words echoed what Edward had long believed. Catherine possessed something the monarchy desperately needed: dignity that couldn't be manufactured. After the meetings, there was a quiet moment between Catherine and Sophie, one that would never make the newspapers but carried immense emotional weight. Sophie, standing beside her, simply whispered, "This is what the Queen always wanted." Catherine smiled, her eyes soft but resolute. Both women knew what those words meant, that Elizabeth's legacy of service had not ended with her passing, but had found new life through Catherine's example. It was a generational passing of the torch, invisible to the public eye, yet profoundly symbolic within the palace. Meanwhile, Edward observed everything with a sense of vindication mixed with cautious pride. He had taken an enormous risk by championing Catherine's role in the tour, and watching the world embrace her confirmed that he had been right. In private, he thanked her with quiet sincerity. "You've restored dignity to all of us," he told her, "and to the family name itself." But Catherine, ever grounded, deflected the praise. "We've all done what we must," she responded. It wasn't humility to show it was her truth. The press, however, had no intention of keeping things so diplomatic. Every paper ran contrasting features between the two women: Catherine, the embodiment of compassion and composure, and Camilla, the embodiment of control and controversy. Tabloids splashed side-by-side images with headlines like "Grace versus Grit" and "The Queen We Didn't Expect." While Catherine's supporters celebrated her rise, Camilla's allies began to panic. Each new photograph, each headline, eroded the authority Camilla had worked years to secure. Her absence from the public stage only amplified Catherine's presence. But beneath the surface of admiration and praise, something far more volatile was taking shape. Those closest to the Queen Consort whispered that she had taken the humiliation personally, that the quiet she now kept was not acceptance, but calculation. The adoration Catherine received was not just a threat to Camilla's influence, but to her very identity within the monarchy. As applause surrounded Catherine, resentment began festering elsewhere in whispers, in late-night calls, in alliances, being quietly reformed. As Catherine prepared for her first royal flight abroad, Camilla's next move would turn admiration into alarm and loyalty into fear. Queen Camilla was not going down quietly. Within days, she summoned her inner circle of senior advisors, allies in Parliament, and a handful of journalists she could still trust. What emerged from that secret meeting was a plan to undermine Edward and Catherine from within the institution itself. But the more Camilla fought back, the more isolated she became, and one royal aide's betrayal would seal her fate. Behind the walls of Clarence House, the Queen Consort's fury turned to strategy. Every loyal aide was ordered into private briefings. She wanted answers, and more importantly, she wanted control. The European tour, once her grand stage, had become her public humiliation. The very family that had welcomed her into the fold now seemed to be dismantling everything she had built. To Camilla, this was no longer about a cancelled trip. It was about survival. She believed that if she didn't act fast, she would be written out of the monarchy's narrative entirely. And so, in hushed meetings behind closed doors, a counterstrike was born. Her allies in Parliament were the first to act. Subtle stories began surfacing in political columns, articles questioning Edward's growing influence, painting him as a man desperate to regain relevance. The leaks were carefully crafted, full of partial truths that twisted perception without directly incriminating anyone. Words like ambition, jealousy, and interference began to swirl around Edward's name. It was classic royal misdirection, a whisper campaign meant to shift public sympathy back toward the Queen Consort. One senior MP, known for his close friendship with Camilla, described Edward's intervention as an unapproved power grab cloaked in moral language. It was a line designed to sting, and it worked. But what Camilla didn't realize was how quickly her actions were eroding the loyalty around her. Palace staff, already weary from weeks of chaos, began losing faith. They had seen how Catherine's composure brought calm, where Camilla's anger brought fear. Assistants whispered that the Queen Consort's team had become a pressure cooker, and even long-time advisors began requesting reassignment to other royal departments. Within days, the cracks in Camilla's once formidable circle began to show. Her desperate attempt to regain control had set off a quiet mutiny within her own walls. Meanwhile, King Charles was visibly deteriorating under the weight of it all. Friends described him as a man divided against himself. His health had already left him fragile, but the emotional toll of watching his wife and brother locked in silent warfare was taking its own toll. He tried to mediate by urging calm, preaching unity. But each conversation ended in more exhaustion. For the first time, even his closest aides began to question whether his reign could withstand another internal fracture. "He's being pulled apart," one confidant confessed, "and there's nothing left to give." When Edward finally learned of Camilla's attempt to smear him, his response was swift but controlled. He didn't retaliate through the press. He went straight to the top. Edward convened a confidential session with the Royal Council, a group tasked with protecting the constitutional integrity of the crown. The meeting was blunt. Edward presented evidence of the leaks, the manipulation, and the growing instability caused by Camilla's circle. His message was simple yet devastating. This ends now. What followed was a formal directive reinforcing Edward's authority in matters of foreign engagement, effectively cutting Camilla off from any influence over royal tours or diplomatic correspondence. It was a quiet but decisive victory, executed with precision and restraint. In the aftermath, Camilla's fury turned into isolation. Her allies in Parliament began to distance themselves, fearful of being tied to her unraveling narrative. The journalists who once printed her words without question now avoided her calls. Within the palace, whispers grew louder that a reckoning was coming, one that would determine not just who led the monarchy's next chapter, but whether the royal family itself could survive its own divisions. What came next would be remembered as one of the most defining confrontations in modern royal history, a moment when truth, loyalty, and legacy collided under one gilded roof. In a private chamber of Buckingham Palace, Edward, Camilla, and Catherine finally came face to face. Words were exchanged that would never make the press, but echoes of that conversation would change everything. Edward stood firm, Catherine remained composed, and Camilla, for the first time, seemed defeated. By the end of that meeting, the Queen Consort agreed to withdraw from future foreign tours. The new face of the monarchy had been chosen, and it was unmistakably Catherine. The air in that secluded chamber was thick with unspoken tension. It was the confrontation no one had expected, but everyone had sensed was inevitable. Edward entered with quiet determination, knowing the gravity of what he was about to say could forever alter the balance of royal power. Camilla arrived already wounded, her pride fractured but her defiance intact. And Catherine, calm, collected, yet resolute, stood as the silent bridge between two worlds, one fading, one rising. For several moments, the room was silent. Then, in a tone both sharp and solemn, Edward began. "This family was built on service, not self-interest," he said. "The crown must reflect the people, not divide them." His words hung in the air, echoing like a verdict. Camilla's response came with fire. Her voice trembled not from fear, but from fury, restrained for too long. She accused Edward of betrayal, of orchestrating her, humiliation under the guise of duty. "You've turned them against me," she said bitterly. "You and your perfect princess." But even in her anger, there was an undertone of exhaustion, the realization that the tide of public opinion was no longer hers to command. Catherine, standing quietly beside Edward, did not respond. She didn't need to. Her composure alone, the poise she had maintained through weeks of chaos, was its own kind of power. As the exchange unfolded, something in Camilla began to crack. The weight of public scrutiny, the endless comparisons, and the slow erosion of her influence all collided in that one moment. Her voice softened, and for the first time, she looked not like a queen defending her reign, but a woman confronting the limits of control. "I fought to keep this family together," she whispered. Edward's reply was firm, but not cruel. "And you nearly broke it in the process." That sentence, simple, direct, devastating, silenced the room. Even Camilla's most loyal aides, waiting outside the chamber, later described the stillness that followed as the moment everything shifted. It was Catherine who finally spoke, her tone as steady as her presence. She thanked Camilla for her years of dedication and acknowledged the weight of her position. "We all serve the same crown," she said gently, "and the world must see unity, not division." Those words pierced through the bitterness lingering between them. Even Camilla's closest confidantes would later admit that Catherine's grace in that moment disarmed the tension more effectively than any argument could have. For all the chaos that had surrounded them, Catherine's humility became the quiet resolution the monarchy needed. By the end of that meeting, Camilla's resistance had faded. There were no grand declarations, no formal announcements, just a weary nod, a silent concession that spoke louder than any speech. She agreed to step back from future foreign tours, citing the need for generational transition. Edward understood what that meant. So did Catherine. It wasn't merely a logistical decision, it was a symbolic passing of the torch. The Queen Consort's era of public dominance had ended, and the new standard-bearer of the monarchy had been chosen not by decree, but by destiny. Later that evening, King Charles was informed of what had transpired. Those who saw him that night said he sat for a long while in silence, holding the report in his hands. There was sadness in his expression, but also a quiet recognition. He knew his brother had been right all along, that Edward's intervention had prevented a deeper collapse of trust within the institution. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Charles reportedly told an aide, "Perhaps this is how it was meant to be. The people must see the heart before they see the crown." That statement would echo through every corridor of the palace in the days that followed. The monarchy, bruised but unbroken, had found its rhythm again, not through power, but through humility. The transition was not official, yet everyone knew what it meant. Catherine had become the living embodiment of what the crown aspired to be: duty without ambition, strength without arrogance, grace without pretense. And as Catherine's plane departed for her first official tour, the cameras captured more than a royal mission. They captured the dawn of a new chapter for the monarchy itself. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.